Okay, now let's move on to other organs in our body that are not glands, but they do have endocrine tissue, so they're able to secrete hormones. And the first organ that we're going to talk about is the pancreas because it secretes two important hormones that help regulate blood glucose levels, so glucagon and insulin. I do have here, even though you'll probably learn this or talk more about this in lab, is that they are secreted from two different types of cells found within the pancreas. So alpha pancreatic cells are the ones that are going to secrete glucagon. The beta pancreatic cells are going to be the ones that secrete insulin. Um, so what is the effect of glucagon? It's what you consider a hormone that is um, hyperglycemic, meaning that it's going to increase blood glucose levels. How does it do that? There's three different ways it can increase blood glucose levels. One is by glycogenolysis, and all that is the process of breaking down glycogen into glucose. Then we can also do gluconeogenesis, and this is how we make glucose from lactic acid and some other proteins. And the third way we can increase blood glucose levels is by releasing glucose from our liver and letting it go into the blood. So the whole purpose or function of glucagon is to increase blood glucose levels. So what is going to stimulate its release? Well, low blood glucose. What would inhibit its release would be high blood glucose and high insulin, which we're about to talk about next. So high insulin levels. Um, for insulin, it has the opposite function of like glucagon, and that would be having what you call a hypoglycemic effect. So it is going to lower blood glucose levels. How does it lower blood glucose levels? Well, it's going to increase the membrane transport of glucose, so allowing glucose to cross the membrane. So that it can get into cells. Predominantly is trying to get glucose into our muscle cells and our fat cells. How else is it going to be able to lower blood glucose? We're going to inhibit glycogenolysis, which we talked about. That was something that glucagon caused. So instead, we're going to inhibit the process of breaking down glycogen into glucose. And with that, we're also going to inhibit the conversion of amino acids and fat into glucose. So what this does, when we're talking about insulin, what is its effect on the brain? It's actually going to help with nervous tissue development, different types of feeding behavior that we have, and learning and memory. So insulin is really important. We'll talk about the effects if we don't have enough insulin in our body. So basically what insulin does, I kind of want to is insulin is going to bind its receptor on the plasma membrane, and it's going to promote glucose uptake into the to whatever cell that is binding. Glucose can go then and do a couple of different things. It can be used in ATP production. So we're talking about cellular respiration. We begin with glycolysis, and glycolysis begins with a glucose molecule. The other thing we can do with glucose, what's inside the cell, is we can form glycogen. And glycogen is just two glucose molecules stuck together. So we took two monosaccharides and we make glycogen, which is a disaccharide. And the third thing glucose can do is we can convert it into fat. Okay, so let's talk about, I don't know why those are so low. What happens if we have low or hyposecretion of insulin? So if we get low or hyposecretion of insulin, we get diabetes mellitus. And we have two types of diabetes mellitus. We have type 1 or type 2. If you are a type 1 diabetic, that means you don't have any insulin at all. So insulin is absent from your body. If you have type 2, well, you do have insulin, but it's not able to function correctly. So it has insulin present, a deficit in its function. Okay, so let's talk about what happens if we have hypersecretion. We call it hyperinsulinism. And basically, you're going to have really, really, really low blood glucose levels, and we need glucose for our brain to function properly. So, what's going to happen if we have uh, hyperinsulinism? We don't have enough glucose getting to our brain, and we can get things like tremors, nervousness, frequent all the time, and disorientation, all kinds of things that are going to happen there. Okay, let's move on to the gonads. So this is your testes and your ovaries. We have three different hormones secreted by your gonads, but if you're a male, you only have one. If you're female, you have two secreted. So let's talk about the androgens first. What do they function in? Basically, they're going to help with the maturity or maturation of your reproductive organs. They're also going to help with secondary sex characteristics and with your sex drive and sperm production. If you're a female, your ovaries can secrete two different hormones. You're going to have estrogen and progesterone. So estrogen is primarily going to function in the maturity as well um, of your reproductive organs. And the same thing kind of works like androgens. Androgens or testosterone. Um, and that it also helps with the secondary development of secondary sex characteristics. And progesterone doesn't normally work by itself, it works in conjunction with estrogen. And when it works in conjunction with estrogen, it can promote breast development and help with your menstrual cycle. Okay, now we can talk a little bit about the placenta. This is what you call a temporary endocrine gland because obviously you only have it if you are pregnant. The only thing I want you to worry about here is the three hormones that can be secreted from the placenta. So estrogen, progesterone, and something called human chronic gonadotropin or HCG. We'll talk about this hormone more when we talk about the reproductive system. So we'll come back to that, the function of that later. Now we can move on to adipose tissue. So it does also contain some endocrine tissue in our fat tissue, and it secretes three different hormones. So we have leptin, resistin, and adiponectin. Leptin is really there to tell you how much fat do we have stored in our body at any time. So if we have a high fat content, we're gonna have a high amount of leptin. And what it's going to do is going to tell your brain or your central nervous system that we have enough. So it's going to help suppress your appetite. And because you have a high fat content, it's going to increase your energy expenditure. Resistant, all that is that hormone acts as an antagonist to insulin. And adiponectin is going to work opposite to resistant, and then it's going to basically enhance the effects of insulin. Okay, the GI tract also can secrete hormones. We have secretin, uh, cholecystokin or CCK, and glucose dependent insulinotropic peptide. We are not going to talk about the functions here. We'll talk about it when we get to the digestive system, but still be aware that these are the three hormones secreted from our GI tract. Okay, our heart, it secretes atrial natriuretic peptide or ANP. We've talked about this a couple times now. Once earlier in the hormone lecture and also in the cardiovascular system. So we should know by now that its function is to lower our sodium in our extracellular fluid. And in doing so, it's going to lower our blood volume and decrease our blood pressure. So, what's going to stimulate its release is if we have a high blood pressure. Okay, kidneys, they secrete one hormone, and that's erythropoietin. And erythropoietin basically functions to stimulate bone marrow. Uh, to increase our red blood cell production, because that's what erythropoiesis is making new blood cells. How do we stimulate the release of this hormone from the kidneys? Well, hypoxia. If we have low oxygen levels, that's going to cause us to want to make more red blood cells so we can increase the amount of oxygen we have in our blood. Although it's not an enzyme, or it's not a hormone, I do want to point out that the kidneys also release the renin that converted, so it's an enzyme, not a hormone, that was able to convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 2. Um, the skeletal system secretes one hormone, and that's osteocalcin. And osteocalcin functions to stimulate our beta pancreatic cells to release more insulin. It can also trigger the release of adiponectin, which we talked about earlier. Our skin, that's going to release a hormone. The hormone that it can release is cholecalciferol, or also known as provitamin D3. We talked a little bit about how we need vitamin D in order to absorb calcium. So that's exactly what this does. Is it's going to help with calcium transport across membranes. um, specifically the membranes in our small intestine. And our thymus is our last one that we need to talk about. It releases three different hormones: thymulin, thymopoietins, and thymosins. Just know that these are released by the thymus because as of now, they really don't understand what the function of these hormones are. They just know that they exist. They think they have a role possibly in T lymphocyte development, but they haven't been able to prove that by any means yet. So that's it for the other organs that can release hormones, even though they're not glands.